I mean, it's like the way I always tell people is, do you want to have Metamucil all the time, or do you want to eat something that you enjoy? Well, it's the same for our gut microbes. They want to
Right.
enjoy what they're eating, so they like plant-based, rich, fiber-rich foods such as like what we've seen that really helps is foods that are high in fiber, like artichokes, indigestible, like inulin type fiber. So foods like artichokes, asparagus, onions are really good for building up your bifidobacterium levels. Blueberries are really good for that. So yes, there are certain foods that are plant-based. Lentils are another, really good food to kind of build up our beneficial gut bacteria. But really, more importantly, too, is foods that are fermented, like kimchi, or fermented vegetables and fruits, or yogurts and kefir, things like that. Those you're either ingesting the bacteria, or you're ingesting foods that feed your bacteria, and that's really what we as a society need to kind of really focus on to improve our health.
This morning, once again, with Dr. Christine Bishara. And our last time here, Dr. Bishara spoke on a number of topics, talking about integrative medicine, um, talking about her path of discovery, toward her present career, some of the research, just basics on her research about COVID-19, and basically about the scientific process and discovery. Dr. Bashar, this time maybe you could describe your background and your credentials yourself. I think that might be best. Thanks.
Sure. So my background is in internal medicine. I've been practicing medicine for over 20 years. However, just the past few years, I've kind of not necessarily strayed away from traditional internal medicine, but more focused on integrative medicine, which is medicine that incorporates holistic approaches to weight loss, but also really addressing the gut health and the gut brain axis as the primary focus of wellness and overall health. So, as much as my background in internal medicine provides me with the opportunity to get to know my patients and really dig deep into their medical problems, it also allows me to be able to see a more functional approach to healing, which I think so many of us physicians have not been trained to do. I've always been really passionate about nutrition ever since I was in medical school. So for me, it's just something that comes naturally to really help people help their body um, survive and heal, because really our body is the best survival machine. I call it, I have a saying, I say your body is the best doctor, and I really believe that.
Okay, thank you so much. And I have a question on that. Okay, so basically, you're a physician, but you deal with more variables than most doctors. In other words, you take into account aspects of the person that more traditional physicians, like I guess suppose you were before you got into this variant of medicine. Is that a good way of describing it?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, I've always really been passionate about nutrition
Right.
and holistic approaches. Ever since medical school, I just never really had the opportunity, I guess, and the time to discuss them in a traditional setting. And I think it's really unfortunate that we as physicians are providing for our patients, and there's a place for pharmaceuticals, and I have no problem with that, but I also feel like we have a huge gap of information to provide our patients in terms of prevention, and we're really not able to do that based on a lot of time constraints, but also
Right.
just inability to have the time to speak to our patients, and a lot of doctors aren't really educated in that aspect of medicine, which I think really needs to change on the medical school level.
Okay, I think that's important. Thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah.
Bashar. So, getting back, picking up where we left off last time, Dr. Bashar is co-author of an important study, first of its kind, regarding gut flora imbalances and how it relates to COVID-19. So, Dr. Bashar, Can you describe the discovery that your research group made in simplest terms? And you can go as complex as you want. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we kind of fell upon the discovery based on the demographics. So I live in New York City, and New York City was hit pretty early in the pandemic with COVID, and we were hit pretty hard. And, my practice is not really considered an essential practice at the time, so it was closed. Whereas my husband, who's a critical care physician and pulmonologist, had the opposite effect, where he and his colleagues were kind of just thrust onto the front lines, treating all these really sick patients in the ICU. And it was really kind of as a result of our nightly conversations of him and myself discussing what was going on with his really sick COVID patients. And to make a long story short, basically one of the first treatments that they were giving in the ICU were medications that inhibited a pro-inflammatory marker called interleukin-6, so IL-6. They were giving IL-6 inhibitors, and they were finding that those were having a little bit of effect on their patients. And it's important to see why interleukin-6 is so important, because interleukin-6 is released by our body. We can talk a little bit further about that, but it's released by our body. It's an inflammatory marker. It's our body's way of protecting us, but unfortunately, it's too much of a good thing, and we'll definitely discuss that further. But regarding the discovery, we started kind of seeing the demographics of the patients that he was seeing, and a lot of them were the elderly and the diabetics and the heart disease and all those people that they were reporting on the news. But then there were patients that were really no medical problems, young, maybe just a little bit of a high BMI, and they were getting really, really sick. So, him knowing that I focus a lot on weight loss in my practice, we kind of had this discussion. And basically, so patients who are, above a BMI of a certain number, usually above 27, they're inflamed, right? And so they have high interleukin-6 levels usually. And so the best way to describe it is soldiers in war, for example. If they're prepared, they've had a good night's sleep, they have all their supplies, they're ready in the morning to attack the enemy, they're ready and they're fighting, right? But think about soldiers who've been in a war for a prolonged period of time, they're fatigued, they don't have the supplies anymore, they haven't slept well. Who do you think is going to perform better in battle? Definitely the ones that are prepared. And so if you look at COVID and how it affected certain people, it's basically the same thing. So those who are already pre-inflamed, right, those who had these conditions that made them more inflammatory than others, really weren't prepared to fight COVID the way that other people were. And so what happened was, because they had these high interleukin-6 levels, right, inflammatory markers, they were already inflamed, their body went into almost like a hyper-exaggerated overdrive, where it just wasn't able to confine the virus properly. And this is where we get that term cytokine storm. And so a cytokine storm is really what was causing people to get really sick and die. And yes, it was the virus, but the virus was indirectly causing the illness. It was more the body's reaction to it, this cytokine storm. And so the cytokine storm, like I said, just kind of releases all these really potent inflammatory mediators in the body, and that increased inflammation is actually what makes people really sick, because the body's trying to fight, but it's damaging its own tissues in the process. So anyway, we kind of started talking about that, and then, just in the back of my mind, I know the importance of gut health and its relationship to the immune system, and there was something kind of lingering in my head about children really were not getting very sick at all. They were getting COVID, and not, it was like a cold to them. And so I know that the gut of children varies differently from adults, and this is kind of God's or nature's way of ensuring that they have a good immune system. And so we started looking at the gut to see what maybe it was in the gut that was protecting children. And children's gut microbiome is very different from adults. They have a very high percentage of a bacteria called bifidobacterium. Up to 80% of their gut, like usually between 60 to 80% of children's guts have this bacteria. And so when you look at this bacteria, you find that it's a potent immune regulator, and one of its functions, its main functions, it has many functions, many beneficial functions for the body, but one of its main functions is to actually downregulate interleukin-6. So now if you're posing somebody who develops COVID, they have really, really high levels of interleukin-6, but guess what? Those are the same people that are very deficient in bifidobacterium. So they don't have that feedback, right? They don't have that ability to downregulate interleukin-6, which is causing this cytokine storm because they don't have enough bifidobacterium. So people a lot of times ask me, well, why don't they have a lot of bifidobacterium, these people that are getting really sick? And it really boils down to diet, the environment that we're placed in. Children have very high levels, and it starts to decrease as we age. But there are people that are adults that have a good amount of bifidobacterium that protected them. And these are the people that really, I hate to say it, but survived COVID. And those who did not have any bifidobacterium in their gut, unfortunately, were probably the ones who succumbed to it. So we came to the realization that what was protecting children was this high level of bifidobacterium in their gut. And, when we first said it, everyone was like, this is crazy. How could one bacteria make such a difference? But bifidobacterium has been studied for many years. If you look up bifidobacterium, there's research studies on how patients who were getting the flu vaccine, or even patients who had the flu and had higher levels of bifidobacterium, actually did much better. But it also helps with inflammation and conditions such as asthma. It helps with newborns. So it's definitely a very well-studied probiotic. It's one of the beneficial ones that we know of. And so this is really where we kind of made that hypothesis, right? Because we couldn't test stool of patients, but just kind of putting two and two together, we made this hypothesis. We came to a conclusion that perhaps the gut was what was protecting children, and if we give patients very high doses of a probiotic containing this bacteria, that they could actually do better. And unfortunately, we weren't able to test patients in the stool, but further studies after ours did have some clinical studies that did show that patients who were really sick in the ICU were actually deficient in bifidobacterium. And then many other studies started to come out about probiotics, but also I think an Israeli study came out about giving patients yogurt, and that helped with COVID. So now, 2023, 3 years after all of this, we are seeing that now gut health and COVID are very, very intricately linked. And there are now several studies that are showing this link, and now our hypothesis has kind of been proven by the fact that there have been supportive studies that have shown this in clinical data. There you go. It's a long story, as short as I can.
Thank you, Dr. Bishara. So, that's really interesting. One of my questions is, why do people with high BMI, is it just a microbiome thing? And if so, why does a high BMI lead to an imbalance in a lot less bifidobacterium? Is it just...
Yeah. So bifidobacterium, I try to explain to people that you have this whole other world inside of you living in your gut. And I kind of relate the gut to like a factory, right? And so you have these bacteria that are living there that are kind of like the factory workers, and one of them is bifidobacterium. And so bifidobacterium needs to eat, right? They're a live organism. They need to feed on food, and unfortunately, they only feed on plant-based foods, fiber, right? They need to digest fiber, and that's how they grow. So if we're eating a lot of fiber-rich foods, like plant-based foods, fruits and vegetables, we're going to increase our levels of bifidobacterium. Another way that we can increase our levels of bifidobacterium is through fermented foods. And unfortunately, we found that people who are obese probably not eating the best diet, right? They're probably eating more of a processed diet, more of foods that really aren't enriching our gut microbiome with these species. And unfortunately, all the chemicals that we're surrounded with, all the environmental toxins, all the things that we're consuming, both through our mouths, but also externally, are really affecting our gut microbiome, and they're killing off a lot of beneficial gut bacteria. And I think hopefully COVID is a wake-up call for countries like the U.S., where we really didn't do that well. And I think a lot of it is because we become a country that really consumes so much more processed foods than, like countries like Africa, where they really didn't have such a huge problem with COVID.
Okay, that's interesting. So, do you think it's possible then that in other cultures where they have a more traditional diet, I mean, this is your specialization. One of the things is helping people with eating and stuff. So, like, is it possible? I know this hasn't been tested that a person who's obese in this country and a person who's obese in, like, let's say a traditional African country, still eating their traditional diet, but for whatever reason has a higher BMI, that they might be faring better just because they're still eating traditional foods?
I think so. I mean, if you look at like sub-Saharan Africa, first of all, they don't really have high obesity rates there.
Okay.
They have the lowest incidence of colon cancer. And I think it's partly attributed to vitamin D exposure. They have a lot more sun exposure, but I do believe that it does definitely correlate to their gut, their microbiome. They're eating a lot of foods that are raised in good soil. They're eating a lot of plant-based fibers, and I think it's really helping them to keep their gut microbiome healthy versus, nations that are like the U.S. where we're not really. I mean, I think the average person eats less than 2 servings of vegetables a day, and that's not really helping our gut, and it's not helping our immune system, which is partly in our gut.
So is
So
there a certain kind of fiber that's better? I mean, people could take Metamucil, or is that not?
yeah, I mean, it's like the way I always tell people is, do you want to have Metamucil all the time, or do you want to eat something that you enjoy? Well, it's the same for our gut microbes. They want to enjoy what they're eating, so they like plant-based, rich, fiber-rich foods such as like what we've seen that really helps is foods that are high in fiber, like artichokes, indigestible, like inulin type fiber. So foods like artichokes, asparagus, onions are really good for building up your bifidobacterium levels. Blueberries are really good for that. So yes, there are certain foods that are plant-based. Lentils are another, really good food to kind of build up our beneficial gut bacteria. But really, more importantly, too, is foods that are fermented, like kimchi or fermented vegetables and fruits, or yogurts and kefir, things like that. Those you're ingesting. You're either ingesting the bacteria or you're ingesting foods that feed your bacteria, and that's really what we as a society need to kind of really focus on to improve our health.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bishara. That's kind of like the answer to my next question, which was, what does it mean for our readers or people watching the video, and what should they do, not do, and is it that simple?
Believe it or not, it is pretty simple. You can change your gut microbiome composition within a month. And we see this all the time, like people who travel, right? And you travel to a different country and you're there for a few weeks, and then your gut microbiome changes a little bit. So you can definitely help to improve your gut health by starting to incorporate these plant-based foods and fermented foods into your diet. And again, our body is extremely resilient. Our body's always looking for the best survival tactics, so it'll figure things out. There are a lot of people that have obviously allergies and intolerances, so this is where the uniqueness of a wellness evaluation, which I do, kind of plays a role, but also doing a gut analysis to kind of look and see, how are you different from me? What's going on with you in terms of, the balance of good and bad bacteria. So a lot of it, yes, it's simple, but then there's all these little intricacies that we also have to focus on.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bishara. What about stress? Is that a factor in this?
Yeah. So when we were doing our research, I was kind of digging in a little bit to look at interleukin 6 and what causes elevations. And, believe it or not, stress is a big factor in elevating the inflammatory markers in our body, like interleukin 6, but also like cortisol. So all of these inflammatory mediators are good short term, right? Because it kind of helps our body, for example, run away from a bear if we're, in the woods or in the wild. So these inflammation helps our body kind of rev itself up. But unfortunately, prolonged stress is something that is not good for the body, because then when we have these inflammatory mediators that are elevated and markers that are elevated for prolonged periods, they cause more damage to the body, as we see, for example, in the cytokine storm, but in a more chronic way if they're constantly elevated. And we've seen links to stress with interleukin 6 levels, cancers, A lot of inflammatory conditions also cause elevated interleukin 6 levels. So definitely a link, I think.
Okay, thank you. And what about genetics? Has there been any research into any kind of like genetic profiling of who would have these elevated levels?
Yeah, I mean, I think genetics definitely plays a role when we see this with so many conditions. But I also believe that epigenetics also can, help manipulate our genes and change them. And we're now seeing that epigenetics might actually be more important than genetics. Definitely there is some genetic, I guess, not necessarily predisposition, but we did see certain people that didn't do as well with COVID, for example, than others. There was one study that was kind of exploring why people in Africa didn't necessarily get as sick, and they were saying, well, maybe it's because they had the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis, and that was protective. But there's definitely factors that play a role in genetics. But like, for example, if you look at somebody who is Asian or Africans, they actually have a much higher rate of lactose intolerance than somebody, for example, from Europe, especially Northern Europe. So there was a study that I came across that said that more than 90% of people with ancestry from Zambia are lactose intolerant versus 2% of the people with ancestry from Denmark. And the reason being is that we're a society based on what we were exposed to, what our ancestors were exposed to in their environment. So if you take a look at somebody like who's lactose intolerant, for example, you look at their environment, their ancestors hundreds of years ago, is they didn't really have the environment that was conducive to raising cattle properly. Like the hotter the climate, the more likely you are to develop lactose intolerance because of the fact that your ancestors probably weren't able to raise cows and providing milk from the cows as efficiently as ancestors from Europe, for example. And part of it is because just the environment that they were raised in were not conducive to healthy cattle, for example.
Okay, thank you. I had this as a question. I don't know if this is actually, it seems a little vague, but what are some ways to prevent these kind of cytokine storms? Like what, I mean, aside you've already said about preemptively using probiotics, but once it's happening, like in the acute phase, like can you eat yogurt to help stop it, or at that point is it too late for yogurt to be effective?
You're speaking about COVID?
Yeah, well, COVID, yes.
Oh, no, actually, early on in the pandemic, when some of my patients were getting really sick, I was giving them a very high dose of vitamin D and a very high dose of probiotics, like more than 100 billion bifidobacterium in their protocol, and not 100 billion just bifidobacterium, but 100 billion of multiple, including bifidobacterium, and they did fairly well. So no, it's not necessarily late. I mean, obviously, those people who have a healthier gut don't have that chronic interleukin 6 elevation, so they will do a little bit better. But I don't think it's too late. I think there was a study that came out of Italy. In September of 2020, Dr. Claudio De Simone, who gave ICU patients, or I think it was just hospitalized patients that came in, very high dose probiotics, and they fared much better than the patient subset that didn't get probiotics. So definitely not too late. Obviously, it's better if you're ready for the battle beforehand, but that was definitely something that I think could have helped a lot of people and did help a lot of people that knew about it and were prescribed these high doses of vitamin D and probiotics.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bishara. So, as a society, and as an individual, we were forced to deal with this, and perhaps your discovery has broader implications for other pathogens where people might get the same kind of immune reaction. How do you feel about that? We've never really studied it, but here we were with COVID where the attention was focused on it. You had the time because you were sidelined and you had the want to help your patients. So do you think that this might apply more broadly to many other conditions?
Absolutely, and I think this has really kind of helped me sideline my passion for my patients as well. as a result of this, I've really kind of done more research into gut health and how it plays a role in really in every aspect of our health. And it does. We're seeing where our organisms in our gut are actually sending signals to our brain, to the satiety center, and they're shutting off, the feedback loop. And if you have a lot of good bacteria in your gut, they're going to shut that feedback loop off, and you're not going to necessarily feel as hungry. So it definitely plays a role in weight loss. But we're now seeing the gut microbiome is playing a role in neurological conditions such as autism, Parkinson's, so many conditions, to be honest. So definitely, I think the future of medicine has to incorporate gut health as its primary focus, because this is really where the core of all chronic illnesses start, and we haven't really tapped into it. But it's something that I think is so important to address, because really gut health is the core of where gut inflammation starts, but then that kind of ricochets into systemic inflammation, and that's where we really start to see chronic illnesses and cancers and all these conditions and diseases that we're seeing.
Okay, and I've read that some people whose ancestors had survived the plague in Europe may have had some resistance against HIV and other viruses because they had survived that, their ancestors. Yet they may also have an increased tendency to have these runaway cytokine storms when exposed to viral pathogens. And you already answered this pretty to some extent. How do cytokine reactions differ amongst historical populations on Earth, and why? You kind of answered that too.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, genetics is powerful, but I think epigenetics is also just as powerful. I mean, you look at like Japanese or Chinese populations, and they have very low numbers of people who are obese. But then you look at generation Asian populations in the U.S., and that number changes, right? So, yes, there is a genetic predisposition definitely to certain conditions and the ability to handle certain conditions, but I also think epigenetics is as important, if not more important, in how we handle conditions. And as to what you're saying, there were people that were exposed to the first SARS. There was a SARS-1 and SARS-2, which is COVID. People who were exposed to SARS-1 and were infected, actually, there was a study that showed that they did much better when exposed to SARS-2. And I think part of it is because your immune system is primed to see something like this as familiar. I mean, we have T cells, we have B cells in our immune system, and T cells have memory cells that will actually remember a previous response to a similar virus and kind of kick into gear at a faster pace and help us. So we did see that. So there's definitely a role, but I think we can't just say, okay, it's in my genes, or my ancestors had this or whatever. I mean, epigenetics plays a huge role too, and we really need to appreciate that more and utilize it more.
Okay, now moving on to the microbiome. What is the microbiome, and what percentage of the cells in our bodies are not ours, but rather bacteria, fungus, and viruses?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research that still needs to be done on that. Some people say we're more than 90% our gut microbiome, and then I see some other studies that say we're 40 to 50% our microbiome. So whether or not we're 40 to 50% or not, what is important is that our microbiome does play a huge role in everything that we go through. It plays a role in producing vitamins. It plays a role in keeping our lining healthy. It plays a role in making neurotransmitters that affect our brain health, our mood. Serotonin is one that's made in the gut. So definitely a large role that the gut microbiome plays. Whether or not it occupies, a large part of us, I guess it's still kind of a research in progress. But what I've seen is they say that we're about 40 to 50% human, and the rest microbiome. Some people think it's more.
Wow, I would think that even if we were like 10 or 20% other, that would be crazy.
Yeah,
okay.
I think about it, I'm like, oh wow, it's like organisms that aren't me, right? Great. So it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Dr. Bishara, why are some bacteria pathogens while others are friendly to our bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's like everything in life. Why is there evil and why is there good, right? Always a kind of a balance of bad and good. And I
Yeah.
guess it's more probably a survival tactic too. Like, why is COVID so, dangerous to us?
Right.
The virus wants to survive, right? And it has different ways of surviving. So that's probably what it is. They just the microorganisms survive in a certain way, and some are beneficial, like bifidobacterium. They're in us. They're thriving. They're eating the fiber-rich foods, and if we're not feeding them properly, they're dying off, right? So they're not surviving. But then you have other microbes that survive in a more not so healthy environment. So it's really more of just survival patterns for viruses and bacteria.
Okay. Um, could we live without a microbiome? And what couldn't our bodies do?
Yeah, I mean, people have their large intestine removed all the time, right? For cancers, for example, or inflammatory bowel. I mean, people have colectomies, total colectomies, and they're able to survive. So we can live without our gut. I've never seen anyone that has complete from mouth to anus removed and survived too long. But our gut does play a huge role, and people who do have total colectomies. You have to be very careful because you're losing a large part of your immune cells in your gut, and we talked about this, but your gut is making these short chain fatty acids that help with the immune system, but help to make nutrients and certain neurotransmitters. So can we live without our gut? Yes, but we have to be very careful to focus on keeping our immune system healthy.
Okay, thank you. And how many different types of bacteria are there in the average person? How much does the gut microbiome differ from person to person?
It differs. It differs a good amount. I mean, people living in certain regions have more similar gut microbiomes in a way, but then you look at people who are overweight, or you look at people who are thin, and thin individuals have very different bacteria from patients who are overweight. And they always say, like, if you want to lose weight, hang out with thin people, because your microbiome starts to resemble the people that you hang out with the most people you live with. So in that aspect, it does differ between different individuals. It also can differ greatly if you travel overseas. Like, for example, my gut microbiome in New York is probably very different from somebody in Mozambique, for example. So there's different variations. I'm not saying one is necessarily healthier or not, but we have thousands of microorganisms living in our gut, and just depending on the soil, right, and the different foods that we're eating, we're enriching different strains of bacteria and viruses in our microbiome.
Okay, and Dr. Bishara, when you talk about vegetables and plant fibers, if they're cooked, does that do something bad or?
Not necessarily. I mean, they say that raw is better, but cooked vegetables are good too. And if you're thinking about it, like, cooked vegetables still have that fiber that's indigestible. Our body cannot digest the fiber that's in these foods. And so you still have the fiber that you're consuming, and your gut microbes are feeding on that fiber. And then whatever they don't need, then that comes out in the stool, right? So cooked, is fine. They say it's good to have raw, fresh vegetables, because then you're really kind of absorbing more of the nutrients and the vitamins that are in those vegetables. But a good variation of everything is what I really recommend.
Okay, and what are some important friendly bacteria inside our bodies? And you've kind of gone over this already. What do they do for us?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite is bifidobacterium. I think it's really the MVP of COVID. And as we talked about, bifidobacterium has so many great functions. It downregulates the inflammatory markers in the immune system. It keeps our gut lining healthy. It helps with so many immune functions. But then the other one that's kind of probably just as important and just as famous is lactobacillus. I would say those two are really the most beneficial, but there are others that are beneficial as well. Like Saccharomyces is another one. And we can get them from different foods that I mentioned, fermented foods. things like yogurt. Lactobacillus has a lot of yogurt in it. Um, different foods, just a variety is really what we've seen is more beneficial for our gut, so that we help to grow all these beneficial microbes. So those are really the two most important ones. So
Okay. And Dr. Bishara, what are some bacteria that we want to keep in check and why?
yeah, it's interesting. So kind of thinking about the ones that obviously we don't want, like H. pylori is a big one that you don't want, right? Because that one, starts to feed on the mucous membranes of the stomach, and then it can cause problems with ulcers and gastritis. So H. pylori is definitely one that we want to kind of keep in check. Another one is, people will get like Clostridium difficile, like C. diff, infections in the colon. C. diff is another one that's not good. Certain strains of E. coli are not good. E. coli obviously is the most common pathogen in stool. It's not the most common, but it's present in stool, and for the most part, it's not bad. But certain strains of E. coli are bad. There's another strain called ruminococcus, which there's like certain strains that are good and certain strains that are bad. So it really depends. It's really more about just keeping that ratio of good versus bad higher, obviously for the good, so that your gut thrives. And what we've seen is, again, diversity of microorganisms really the most important thing in keeping your gut healthy.
Okay, and Dr. Bishara, here I had written the wrong microbiome. I mean, I guess there can be a certain thing for an individual as a wrong microbiome for them. Can that cause cancer or contribute to disease? It sounds like
Yeah, I mean, we look at people who develop inflammatory bowel disease or colon cancer, and you do see there's a good amount of gut dysbiosis, which means that there's breakdown of the lining of the gut, and the microorganisms are not as healthy, and you see these people responding, like people with inflammatory bowel. We're seeing some of them respond to fecal transplants, and you're injecting feces from another person into this unhealthy gut, and we're seeing that they do get better. So there's definitely a bad gut microbiome, and I think a lot of it also kind of stems from some kind of toxins that we were exposed to. The other thing that probably not so politically correct, but we're seeing a lot of babies that aren't breastfed. I don't know how old you are, but I'm in my 50s, and in my generation, our parents were told to bottle feed because it was like healthier, but we didn't get that great dose of Bifidobacterium breve, which is one of the strains that's in breast milk, and it's only in breast milk, and it's such a potent immune regulator, and it's so important for our immune health. And we kind of started out life without being primed. Our immune system wanted to kickstart, but it didn't get that chance, right? So I recommend to everyone, if you really want to kind of set your child up for life, breastfeed as much as you can, because one sec. Yeah. Sorry. Breastfeed as much as you can, even if it's a week, because you're providing your baby with Bifidobacterium breve, which is so important for gut health and immune health, and it primes you.
Thank you so much. So, infant formula studies show that infant digestive system microbiomes are far different in exclusively breastfed babies and formula-fed babies. And like you were saying, it's the bifidobacteria that predominates in the breastfed babies, while the formula-fed babies have Clostridia at moderate to high levels, and in them, bifidobacteria is lower. So, do you think that this is all about societal change? What you were saying about breastfeeding and how it's becoming more of an accepted and popular thing. So these are all our day-to-day life practices, how we eat, how babies are fed, I guess dealing with stress. Is there something else that we haven't mentioned out of those? What?
Yeah, I mean, everything you said, I agree with. Limiting the processed foods that we have, they disrupt the gut. Foods that are rich in high fructose corn syrup, or all the dyes that we're putting in our foods that are banned in certain parts of the world, are causing a disruption. And the elephant in the room is alcohol, where everybody thinks it's okay to drink alcohol, even like once or twice a week, but it really is destroying our gut too. So all these things that we as a society have gotten used to, mainly out of convenience, right? We're not really cooking our meals as much anymore. Moms aren't breastfeeding. I mean, I guess some are. But, and again, this is not to shame anyone, because I know there are certain indications where you can't breastfeed. But, there's definitely ways that we can prime our children's guts. And unfortunately, we're kind of starting them off on the wrong foot just from, like simple things like that. So, those are the kind of changes that I would hope to see in society, is that we encourage more natural approaches and more, and this is all like community based too, right? Eating together, if you can't cook one day, come together as a community and cook and be together. That makes such a huge difference on our health, but also our microbiome.
Thank you, Dr. Bishara. That's a good insight how it ties to community.
Yeah. Have you heard of the Rosetta effect?
I'm not sure if you had mentioned it to me.
Okay,
or
maybe. Anyway, it's about the population of Italian immigrants that were living in a Pennsylvania town called Roseto, and they had like very low incidence of heart disease and any other chronic illnesses, and they were eating kind of like very similar foods, like high fat foods and rich foods, but they were finding that the community based eating, and they had intergenerational people living in homes like grandma and nana and parents, and the kids were all living together, and they said that really helped with the stress, but also their tendency to not develop chronic illnesses.
Okay. And when you say processed foods, does that mean anything that's made in a factory? Like, I know, like, you could buy bread that comes like in a package. Is that processed too? Like,
I mean, it's like different brands of bread. I mean, if it's bread that's made fresh in a bakery and they bag it, it's fine. And my family gets really annoyed with me because I will only buy fresh bread, but then it goes bad right after a day or two, so I'll freeze it so that it doesn't go bad. And they always get really annoyed with me, and they're like, "Why don't you leave it out?" I'm like, "Because it's going to go bad." But then there's bread that will sit in a bag. I won't name which bread that is, but we all know there's bread you can leave literally in the bag for few weeks and nothing happens to it. It's because it has those preservatives in there that are keeping it for prolonged periods, but those preservatives are damaging our gut.
Okay, thank you so much. Now what about FOS and XOS and alpha GOS? Those are some I just learned about, that breast milk contains all these, and they're supposed to be good food for the friendly bacteria. Like, as adults, are these available as supplements, and should people bother with this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I get that question a lot. I think probiotics and supplements are fine, and I feel like they're like the cherry on top. But you can't probiotic your way out of an unhealthy gut, so you really have to start at the basics, and that's really with food and lifestyle. And even things like exercise have been shown to improve the gut microbiome. So you want to start with those, and then supplements are I guess just like an add-on. But food is what we really need to change in the U.S. The types of food that we're eating and the way that we're eating.
Okay. Next, I have gut analysis kit all by itself. Is that relevant to you somehow?
I will do a gut analysis kit on all my patients who do my weight loss program, just because I like to look at what common cells they have in their gut. For example, we know patients who are obese are very deficient in bifidobacterium. A lot of times they're also deficient in Akkermansia, as another one. So I'll definitely look at the gut gut analysis will also tell me if they have, H. pylori or SIBO, or kind of the ratio of the good and bad bacteria that we talked about. So to me, it's like getting a simple blood test. For me, I like to look at the gut analysis so that I can kind of approach the treatment strategies in a way to help my patients.
Okay. So I think then some future world that we hopefully will make it to, this will be like routine, like a blood test, then potentially.
Yeah, that's my hope. And again, we're learning so much about the gut microbiome. I mean, I think even people who are so specialized in the gut still don't know a lot about the gut, is because we really just haven't tapped into as much information as there is out there. So, I think a gut microbiome analysis is going to continue to get better. But right now, I use it more to, it's almost just kind of like a reassurance to my patients, but also say, listen, you're kind of deficient in this, and, we need to eat more foods that help to build this up, for example. So I use it more of like a reinforcement for my patients, and also just to look for things that we might not have figured out in our evaluation that might be causing their symptoms.
Right, that's great, because I know some people are like, well, none of this stuff really, and then you have the data right there, and it's like, well, actually, and
again, as we mentioned before, gut microbiomes differ greatly. So somebody in Africa has a very different gut than, like species than somebody in the U.S. But at the same time, there are certain strains that you're looking for, like those two big ones, Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium, that you definitely want in your gut, and that's across the board. There's different strains that are, more prevalent in certain environments, but you at least want to have that kind of that information.
Okay. Now, some of our readers likely feel that eating too many vegetables can be bad for their health, and that a plant-based diet is tantamount to suicide. I mean, I've heard this from a lot of people, like, especially when people have, cut down on their meat or really cut meat out of their life, other people are concerned, like, what are the actual facts on this? Can you eat too many vegetables?
I'm a big believer in really moderation of everything, and I know just based on the studies, right, because we have to look at data and studies, and based on that, the Mediterranean diet has been the one that's kind of come out as the healthiest diet, and Mediterranean is mostly plant-based. It does incorporate a lot of really good healthy foods such as nuts and olives. They do eat meat. It's very minimal, and it's usually in the form of like a pescatarian option. But if you look at the data points to that kind of diet. Now, I know a lot of people will choose a only plant-based diet, like a vegan diet, and my only problem with a vegan diet is if you are able to really micromanage what you're eating and make sure that you're getting an adequate intake of certain proteins and fats and nutrients to really help you, and taking vitamin B supplementation, then if it works for you, that's great. But unfortunately, I think that the majority of people that go on vegan diets are really not meticulous with what they're eating, and so this is where we start to see issues with a vegan diet per se. So I don't necessarily think a vegan diet per se is bad. I just think that most people are not able to really be meticulous about it. So I think that's probably why the Mediterranean diet has been kind of shown to be the most beneficial, because yes, it is mostly plant-based, but it does have that little bit of animal protein that can help us with vitamin B and different nutrients.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bishara. So, I mean, you've mostly answered already, but how important is diet and wellness? What about exercise? I mean, I can't expect that you're going to give us like exact ratios. What about stress? And I guess this is really the crux of this question, dealing with it constructively.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what percentage each one plays a role. I can tell you that diet and stress are probably one of the two bigger ones. Sleep, and then people always say, like, well, how do I not be stressed? And it's really not necessarily the stressors that you're, exposed to, because we're all exposed to stress. It's really how you react to it. And so there's different ways that you can react to stress. Like, I think what helps me is kind of think about the things that you're grateful for. I sometimes will write a gratitude journal and kind of write down the things that I'm grateful for, that I think are good in my life. Also, a very positive attitude. Yes, this is really bad, but you know what? It's going to get better and it's temporary. There's certain strategies that we can do to help us manage stress, and I think it's really how we respond to stress that is detrimental to our bodies, not the stress itself. And then diet, if you incorporate like 5 to 7 plant-based foods a day in your diet, I always say if you look at your plate in a kind of a pie ratio, 70% of your plate should be some form of plant-based food, and then 30% other. So that kind of makes it easier to follow along. But there's studies that say exercise helps, social communication helps improve our gut microbiome too. But I think probably the two bigger ones are diet and stress lifestyle.
Thank you, Dr. Bishara. And for those who might want to purchase supplements, are all the bifidobacteria supplements the same?
um, well, again, I think diet is really where you want to start. But if you're going to supplement, you want a probiotic that has a lot of strains in it that kind of work together. Definitely want one with bifidobacterium in it because we've seen such a huge effect on the immune system with it. But you also want one that has like a little bit of a higher, they call it colony forming units, which is CFUs. So you want, in my opinion, at least 25 billion, if not more, CFUs, because when you're consuming a probiotic, if you're eating it with food, a lot of it gets damaged or gets killed off in the stomach from the stomach acid. So you want enough to ensure that it's reaching your lower intestines. So the higher the CFU count, the better. It's better to take it on an empty stomach too, so that you're not churning out more acid. When you're eating, your stomach's getting ready to digest the food or break it down. So those kind of play a role a little bit in that. But again, I think the most important way to increase your beneficial gut microbes is through food.
Okay. And I know sometimes some companies market them as being like completely frozen or refrigerated, like end to end. Is that at all significant?
The refrigerated ones tend to be a little bit more stable in that they're, when you have to think about a probiotic in a bottle is you don't know how long it's been sitting on a shelf, right? So the ones that are refrigerated are probably keeping more of the probiotics in there. But there are some that are also encapsulated, through different types of capsules that help to keep the viability. You probably need a higher dose from those. But then there's the other ones that they're spore forming, and you mix them with liquid, and then it activates them when you swallow. So I guess, I don't know, I don't want to say like they're all equivalent, but I would say the ones that are refrigerated are probably more potent, but I think the higher the counts is probably where you really want to look. I think if you're having a probiotic that's like 1 billion, you're probably not getting much in your stomach, and it's probably not surviving that whole transport into your gut.
Okay. And how does that compare with having, like, let's say, a serving of yogurt that's like
Yeah, I don't know how many billion are in yogurt, but I know there's a significant amount of probiotics in a yogurt or a kefir, for example. And they're live, right? And they're fresh, and they're like just made. So I personally make my own yogurt, because then I keep it in the fridge for a week, and I know that those are fresh probiotics that I'm consuming. It's very easy to make, by the way.
okay.
If you go out to the machine, it's like $30, and it's so easy to make it.
Okay. And are all fermented food sources equal? Because you mentioned like kimchi and there's like sauerkraut,
Yeah.
and are all alive with bacteria? And can the bacteria die? Because I've noticed, there's pasteurized brands, mostly pasteurized brands.
Yeah. Well, so the process of pasteurization, right, you're killing off a lot of that stuff. So you might not be getting as much. through that process. But I would say different fermented foods provide different beneficial strains in your gut. So again, you want variety. Variety is the name of the game. You want different fermented foods that grow different strains so that your gut is happy. It's got a variety, and they're all together as a team.
Okay, and Dr. Bishara, does cheese provide healthy gut bacteria?
Yeah, so soft cheeses probably not, just because they haven't been around for too long to kind of grow. Hard cheeses do provide bacteria, but I would say that you don't want to heat them up like a grilled cheese sandwich is probably not providing much of a probiotics because you're again killing off whatever happens to be in the cheese. Hard cheeses are probably more rich in probiotics, but the problem with cheese in general is it's not the best source of probiotics. Number one, not because it doesn't have bacteria in it, but because um, it's very high in saturated fat, which is not as healthy. But also it can like if you're melting it, obviously again it can kill it off the strains. But then a lot of people, if you think about it, are lactose intolerant, and so if they're eating large portions of cheese, they're not going to be able to tolerate the dairy as well.
Okay, and I would say the final question for today would be, what about blue cheese? Is it okay to ingest mold? Like, you see that same, or apparently same stuff growing on bread, and we throw it away, but then,
Yeah.
everyone loves blue cheese, so.
That's actually a really good question. I want to say, don't quote me on this, but I want to say the bacteria that grows in blue cheese might be like a healthy bacteria versus the bacteria that grows in on bread, like moldy bread. And it's also like a controlled environment where they're making cheese, right? So blue cheese again, it has the bacteria and they're beneficial, but it's high in saturated fat, and a lot of people can't tolerate the dairy. So not too much of the cheese. Obviously, everything in moderation again.
Okay, and Dr. Bashar, is there anything else you'd like to say to wrap up for today?
Um, no, I think kind of a take-home message for anyone who's watching is really three simple ways that you can improve your gut health. And those would be from like moms, if you're able to breastfeed your babies, even if it's for a few days and they just get the colostrum, try to see if you can do that. That's one way. Try to eat a variety of plant-based foods in your diet because the variety and the diversity really help to increase the beneficial microbes in your gut. And three is really try to handle stress in different ways and learn coping mechanisms. Whatever it takes, prayer, meditation, gratitude journals, they do make a difference. And I think those three, if we're able to kind of make changes with those, and those are kind of simple things, right? We're not asking people to go out and buy, like something really expensive. These are things that you can do at home basically for free or minimal amounts of money. So those are the take-home messages that I would give.
Okay, yeah, and I think it's cool, like you said, you don't have to go buy a bunch of equipment or buy certain clothes, or do
Yeah.
anything. You just have to make some simple changes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, for example, I just don't have time to go to a gym and exercise. So for me, my way of exercising is to walk, a good amount. I try to do at least 2 to 3 miles a day. But then, I live in New York City, so we have a building. So I take the stairs everywhere I go. So, that's my form of exercise when I can't get exercise in, right? Because people say, oh, I don't have time for the equipment or going to the gym. It's in the simple things that you do on a daily basis that really make a difference.
Yeah, I think that we learned that during COVID when we didn't have the opportunity to do the usual walking around to get normal things and just living a life. We're like, wow, that was actually a lot of exercise because when it became time to do it again, I think myself and others felt like, wow, this is actually exercise. You park at the end of the parking lot and you walk all the way to the store and then back. That's a little bit of exercise right there.
I agree. Like the sedentary lifestyle that we all kind of were forced to live for that 1 year to 2 years, I think really impacted a lot of us, our health. I mean, so many people gained weight, but just being sedentary is really bad for you. It's really not good. Even if you're just walking around, like you said, just, parking the car far away and walking in the parking lot, just every little bit, that activity and that motion helps to provide oxygen to your muscles, and that really makes a difference in, your cells and the health of your cells.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bishara. It was great meeting with you again today, and I wish you well, and I look forward to the next time we get to chat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.